Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video from Aman Talks NRL SuperCoach. Today's preseason video is the 5'8 position analysis and deep dive. Hope you all enjoy this one. Do give it a thumbs up if you do please consider subscribing as well if you are new around here. If you want to follow me on my other platforms, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, links for that in the description below. Join the overall group league, the code is 673281. Without further ado, let's discuss the 5'8s. So in the last video when we talked about the halfback, we identified that there's not really that many halfbacks who are in the top 20 averaging players, but where they are sitting in the top 20 is very, very high. 5'8 position isn't quite in the same mold. It does have probably a very small pool of players who are in that top 20 averaging players, but they're kind of more towards the mid to lower half of that top 20 averaging. So last season we did have Kalen Ponga available at 5'8", but I'm not really going to be counting him because when he went absolutely guns blazing, it was when he was playing at fullback. So I haven't kind of shaded him in blue here. So that meant the top averaging 5'8 from last year was DBrown, who had an average I think of 76.5. You'll also see him appear in 2022 with an average of 74. One of the reasons why a lot of people are looking to him as the best gun 5'8 to go for. Cam Munster is always the ever consistent option, 81 average in 2022, 74 average in 2021, so he was in both years in the top 20. And we had Cody Walker topping it in 2021 with an 84 average. So it is a position where there's not many players in that top 20, but it can creep into that top 20 averaging players. Doesn't probably quite have the high upside of the halfback. A lot of that is probably due to that these 5'8s don't really goal kick. It's mainly the halfbacks that do the goal kicking, typically at least what we see with Cleary and Nico Hines. That's another reason why they kind of just creep up that extra 10 to 12 points in average. But still, 5'8 is a position that is worth, I think, spending up in. And as we're going to get to, it's not a very deep position this year. There's really one or two kind of standout options. And then you're really starting to scrape the barrel with some mid-ranges. And then you've got some cheapies available. But let's get straight into it. So taking a look at the gun options available in the 5'8 position, if you haven't been living under a rock and if you've been around on Twitter and Facebook, you would have seen that DBrown is the preferred gun 5'8 option. And when I say gun, it's the players who've averaged over 65. And last season, there was only DBrown, Cam Munster, and Cody Walker. 76.5, 71.3, 69.1 average respectively for those three. DBrown tops the ownership as well, 19.9% at the time that I have recorded this. And so one of the questions I pulled from Twitter, which I think is very reasonable, what are the realistic options outside of DBrown? Are there any 5'8s who've got an attacking upside and can link like that DBrown and Shaun Lane combination? So I think firstly, just to talk about DBrown, I do think he is the standout 5'8 option. I do think he is the best. Obviously that comes with a high price tag, 780k. But the reasons why I just think DBrown is the best option, number one, he's the most consistent 5'8. Really, really strong base, 37 in base he averaged last season. This isn't a new thing for DBrown either. 2022 he had a base average of 35, and in 2021 he had a base average of 37. So over the last 3 seasons, 37, 35 and 37 in base. So by far he has got the best base average out of any 5'8. That just means he's going to be the most consistent option. He was very frustrating, I believe it was in the 2021 season where he only averaged 53, and that was when he was playing on the right hand side, Moses was playing on the left, and it just didn't work out really for Parramatta, and DBrown really wasn't getting any attacking stats. So I look at that 2021 season where he averaged 53 as really his flaw when he doesn't get really many attacking stats. It's purely just the base and runs and other smaller, offloads and tackle busts, but really not much big attacking stats. So you look at a 5'8", 53 average is kind of his flaw, but then we saw last season and the season before that as well, those attacking stats start to feature into his game. And I just like him because he's a young player, ever improving. You can see last season, really good creative numbers, an average of 24 per game last season. And I think it's just the motivation factor. Obviously, he had his issues off-field last season, which were pretty disappointing. He's come out and says he wants to repay the faith to his teammates. He wants to do much better this season. And I do like buying into these kind of narratives. We'll get onto historical averages for these three guns as well. But I feel like it's something similar with Cam Munster, where 2022, that preseason, he was making big comments saying that he's off the drink, he wants to focus, and he ended up absolutely killing it for SuperCoach, and I believe he averaged 81 or 84, one of the two, I can't remember, I believe it was 81. And that was definitely by far Cam Munster's best averaging season for SuperCoach. I kind of look at DBrown as an ever-proving player, really good draw as well, doesn't have a bye until round 9. There's a lot of factors that I like about him, very consistent, and to me it just feels like he's the option that I can have the most belief in my 5'8 spot. and it's nice knowing that he doesn't have a bye until round 9. You can kind of plug and play him. No matter the opposition, he's normally going to give you at least 55 points just because his base stats are so good. The thing with Dylan Brown, though, he does have some upside to him as well. So out of these 3 gun options, they all had 4 games where they scored over 90 last season. But given he had a smaller sample size, in terms of pure percentage, 24% of the time he was playing last season, he was getting scores over 90. His low score last season was 32, and that was against Melbourne in round 1. After that, his next lowest score was 47. So I really do feel like he's got that really safe floor, but he does have that upside. Combined with a good draw, I think some motivation for him to want to be better this season. It's very easy for me to say Dylan Brown is the best 5'8 option. I don't want to just make the case that he's the only one. Like Cam Munster at 728k, he's obviously coming in expensive, but the thing about Munster is you just know what you're going to get. Just quickly jumping to their averages over the last 4 seasons, you can see with Munster, he's just extremely consistent. 71 average in 2023, 81 2022, 74 2021, 70 in 2020, and I believe 2019 was like 69. So like if you just want someone who you know is going to get you 70 points in average for the season, Cam Munster is probably your guy. And I know there's some narrative about, well, Munster's got a fairly tough draw to start the season, and then he's got that bye in round 4. I don't really look at the tough opposition as a negative for Cam Munster. You can see somewhere on the screen, I've got each of these players average against their opponents that they've got coming up over the first 10 rounds. And you can see that Munster, the opposition really doesn't matter. He's got a 71 average against the Warriors, 74 average against the Newcastle Knights. He's even got a 59 average against Penrith, which is pretty respectable. 74 average against the Broncos. A 75 average against the Rabbitohs, 93 against the Titans. It really doesn't matter who he's playing. He's going to generally score pretty well. He's also got pretty good base stats of himself, 32 in average last season, which is pretty safe. And he's got a better ability to get like tackle busts and offloads compared to the other two. That's why his evasive numbers are a little bit higher as an average from last season. So Munster, I don't think the issue is going to be the draw. I don't really use that as the reason to not start with Munster. 7% owned, like for the gun that we know that Munster is, I do think that there is definitely validity in actually starting with him, knowing that you're just going to get a pretty reliable scorer. It's the round 4 bye, I think, is the big issue, and what it will impact your team elsewhere. So if you're looking at potentially starting with Harry Grant, Ryan Papenhuyzen, FYI, I'm recording this after the first trials game where Papenhuyzen did get a try assist. Wasn't actually goal kicking though in that trial. But let's say eventually you maybe want to start with Papenhuyzen, you want to start with Harry Grant as the best hooker, you want to maybe get a Shawn Blore. All of a sudden, you're going to find that come round 4, if you also go with the Cam Munster, you're going to be really short in that particular week. And also, that's a lot of money that you're going to have from your bench. So I think it probably becomes more of a, how is your team set up? How are the combinations working in your team, for example? I think that's more of the reason why I wouldn't start with Cam Munster, not necessarily the tough draw. So I think if you've got a team set up where maybe say you don't have Harry Grant and you're not going to start with Papenhuyzen, and really you're only going to have maybe Munster and maybe a Shawn Blore, and let's say in your hooker spot you're going someone else like maybe a Jeremy Marshall-King, I think it's perfectly valid to start with Munster over Dylan Brown. I just feel like they're both going to be scoring similar-ish because of the way that they score is fairly similar. This is when again I say, well, if I feel like they're going to score very similarly and the way that they score their points is very close as well, then I will take the guy who's got the better draw and has the bye later on. That's kind of the couple of swing factors that makes me go towards Dylan Brown compared to, say, a Munster. You will be saving around about 52k. Now, 52k doesn't feel like a lot of money, and it does feel like at the beginning of the season when you're trying to figure out other information, it's kind of nice knowing that you can just lock in someone like Dylan Brown and you don't have to worry about him missing a week, say in round 4. That's probably going to be a headache that you might have with Munster, and you really would need to score very, very well in those first 3 rounds for you to at least maybe have some advantage within the kind of first 5 to 6 weeks. Probably those are the factors that make me think I'll lean towards Dylan Brown instead of Munster. Just to answer the question about the attacking combinations, I mean, the Munster-Shawn Blore combination, if Blore does get the starting spot on the left-hand edge, that can be very, very similar to Dillbags and Sean Lane. So I think there is definitely merit if that's the combination you want to go for. But then obviously that means you're going to have that bye in round 4. So you just need to think about that too. He scored about 21% of the time over 90 last season. So not quite that same kind of consistency of a higher score, say to Dylan Brown. But he's just that guy who, like regardless of opposition, he's generally going to get you between 65 to 70 and you don't really need to stress about him. It's just that round 4 bye that puts me off slightly Munster and makes me lean towards Dylan Brown. With Cody Walker at 705k, he didn't start last season super well, but that was due to a tough draw. They had the Sharks, Penrith and the Roosters in the first 3 weeks, and then he scored 30, 44 and 42. When the draw did open up for him, then his scores definitely improved. 80, 76, 132, 106, 66, 73, 86. Like, we're talking good scores here. And he actually had a really good run all the way until round 14. But just kind of post that, he really was, I guess, a victim of how the Rabbitohs really just slumped towards the back end of last year. So I think with Cody, like, I know there is some commentary about, oh, Latrell may take away attacking stats from him. I do think there is some merit to that. But just looking at those scores, when the Rabbitohs had a good draw on paper and when the team was firing, Cody Walker is going to benefit from that. Like, those scores are no joke. And so with Cody, the reasons I probably wouldn't be starting with him is the draw is a bit tougher to start the season. They've got a great Bulldogs matchup in round 4, but outside of that, until the bye in round 7, we're looking at Manly, Broncos, Roosters, Warriors and Sharks. That's not the best draw on paper. Even outside of that, you've got then Melbourne and Penrith. Like, it is a tough start for the Rabbitohs. So I think when you're paying over 700k, plus there is some doubt about him coming into round 1, he's not playing the Indigenous All-Stars game. There are a couple of factors there with Walker that just make me think, I think at some point in the season, he's going to be definitely an option, especially if it comes around that Origin period where, let's say, Latrell is playing Origin, maybe let's say Cody's not. He's going to be running the team for the Rabbitohs, and I would have to, I haven't looked longer term, but I have to think if this is how the Rabbitohs draw is looking from rounds 1 to 10, it surely must be a period where it's going to be looking really good for quite a long stretch. I think that's going to be the time to really target Cody, because I do feel like he is more of a guy who, because he's got lower base stats, 22 average from last season, and he historically is a guy who is a bit less consistent because his base stats are lower, you really need to time it with him, and it really comes down to the draw. So with Cody, because of that tough start, I'm probably not going to be starting with him. I prefer the likes of DBrown or Munster because they've got that base stat that they can fall back on if the game's not quite going their way. They're not going to give you those absolute stinker scores, which Cody, I feel like, can drop those kind of 20, 30 scores in him at times. So I think with Cody, it's a timing thing. I'm leaning towards DBrown and Munster, and based on what I said earlier, DBrown is the guy who I'm leaning towards. But I think if you're someone who's happy to not have too many other Melbourne Storm players, there's absolutely no reason to not start with Munster as well. And 7% ownership for a guy who in previous seasons has been locked into round 1 teams for people. Don't just skip past him without really giving him some serious thought, because at the end of the day, this is Cam Munster. He is the best 5'8" in the NRL, and he can do it on the Supercoach level as well. So looking at some of the other mid-range options in the 5'8", this is when things change really quickly for probably the worst, because outside of this top 3, a lot of these guys who follow on didn't even average over 60. Like Cody Nikorima was the 4th highest averaging 5'8" from 2023, and he's probably not going to be an option for round 1. Number 1, they've got the bye in round 3, which isn't ideal. Number 2, he may not even feature in the starting 13. He benefited last season because there was issues and injuries to Sean O'Sullivan and Isaiah Katoa for the Dolphins, and so he was having a bit of time playing in the halves. He was also playing at fullback as well. Like, his average was 58, but any time he played more than 70 minutes last season in not a utility role, he actually averaged 62, and when he was actually playing at 5'8", number 6, his average was 60. The issue is, though, that I think if the halves are going to be Sean O'Sullivan and Katoa and Nikorima is playing off the bench, he just doesn't become an option. So unfortunately, like, I just can't recommend him really as an option. The next one is probably Tom Dearden. 592k, averaged 58 last season. Now, I've got the CV column in the table, which shows the coefficient of variance, which basically shows how consistent is this player. And the higher the number, the more inconsistent they are. So you generally typically would probably prefer that number to be on the lower side. The issues I have with Tom Dearden is he's a great NRL player, really improving, performs well for Queensland whenever he has. For Supercoach, though, I feel like he's benefited from a few really big outlier scores that are kind of distorting what his price tag is and what his average was from last season. So I've got it in the notes further down to the bottom. He had that really big score last season where he scored 179, and that was against the West Tigers when I think the Cowboys put on like 70 plus points. If you just take out that 179 score, all of a sudden his season-long average became 52.5. I think it's fair to say that a score of 179, you'd have to be pretty lucky to time it correctly with Dearden to get that kind of a massive score out of him. I mean, it's good to note that he has got that big score in him. There was a period in the middle of the season where he had 3 games scoring the 118, 95 and 179, but those were the only 3 games in the entire season where he did score over 90. And so I feel like I mean, the draw for the Cowboys is pretty decent. Dolphins, Dragons, and Titans are in the first 5. But he feels like a player to me who isn't really the most Supercoach friendly, and I feel like you'd have to be pretty lucky to be able to time some of those really big scores. I don't think he's going to be consistently getting you those kind of 60, 70 plus scores that you'd be hoping for in a 5/8 spot, where I do think you can get those scores from some other options. He had a base set average of 26, which is pretty decent. It is the best out of all of these other options I've got on the list here. So he's probably got a slightly higher floor, but he really needs to get some big attacking stats, I think, to get that average up towards the 60 to 65 plus. Given that he had that really big outlier score last season, if I look back to 2022, he also averaged 58. That kind of feels like that's what he's going to get you this season as well. And so I feel like there's probably not a lot of value in him. And I feel like, I mean, it's a big jump in money. We're paying almost 200k extra to go to DBrown. But I think if you're going to make a bet on Tom Dearden, you are partly making a bet on the Cowboys. So he's probably not my preferred mid-range option, and he's going to be a little bit more inconsistent. So I'm not really leaning towards him. Jerome Luai is an interesting one. He's in some doubt as well and racing the clock to be fit for round 1, so that already puts some big question marks on him. Only 1% owned, and that's probably not necessarily because he's going to be potentially a good pod, but I think it is because of these injury issues. And Luai's a weird one. He's had spells where in Supercoach he's actually been a really valid option, where he's gone on to average maybe 65, 70 plus, but they're kind of few and far between. He had 2 games where he scored over 90 last season. But I do find that Penrith have so many other attacking weapons. They've obviously got Nathan Cleary. They've got really gun outside backs in Isaac Dungo. They've got Taruva, Brian To'o, Taylor May. These are all guys who command the ball a lot. And I feel like with Luai, great for the Penrith system, but I feel like it doesn't always translate to Supercoach. That 57.9 average, that really feels like what you're going to get from him. If I look back to 2022, average of 56, 2021, average of 59, 2020, 62. He's actually been kind of slightly on the decline in a marginal way from Supercoach. That's probably also due to just the ever improvement in Nathan Cleary as well. And I guess with Penrith as well, they don't have a fantastic draw. They've got the bye in round 6. That alone probably means I'm probably not going to be leaning towards Luai for round 1. Now, Matt Burton from the Bulldogs. He's one I don't mind taking a punt on, and with all of these guys, there is an element of you are taking a punt. That has to be said. What I like with Burton is, number one, I still think he's goal kicking. So I've recorded this after the Bulldogs have played their first trial. Unfortunately, I haven't actually been able to watch the full match. I've only seen brief highlights. Now, some of the commentary I've seen is that he looked fairly quiet and only really stuck to the left-hand side. And actually, it was Drew Hutchinson who looked really good, playing on the right-hand side for the Bulldogs. Now, if more balls are going to go down that right-hand side and away from Burton, automatically that's a big detraction from him, because those big attacking stats that he would need to get really good scores are going to get reduced. I like that he's goal kicking, but again, Stephen Crichton didn't play in that trials. If Stephen Crichton takes up the goal kicking tee, I think that would pretty much kill Matt Burton as an option for me. Only reason I kind of advocate for him is because he's got that goal kicking and keep improving their attacking ability. That generally would mean more tries and more ability for Burton to actually take some extra goal kicks. So he had an average score last year of 13, generally helped by his goal kicking. Even if that goes up to, say, 15, that's an extra 2, and maybe, let's say, hypothetically, he gets maybe an extra 1 point to his creative numbers if he, gets to form a good combination with, say, Viliame Kikau playing outside of him. Again, another callback to that kind of, can we replicate that Sean Lane, Dylan Brown combination? Matt Burton, Viliame Kikau could be an option. And so I think with Burton, we could potentially see him get up to that maybe low 60s average if he does retain the goal kicking. He has got that ability to have spurts in him where he does score very well for a consistent period of time. And the reason I like Burton as well was that I just think back to last season when there was big discussion about who's the 5'8". Do we go Adam Doueihi or do we go Matt Burton? I think Burton was like 40-something% owned. And you're looking at him as 6% owned. Granted, we get that extra information of 1 year with the Bulldogs, but if we think that they're going to be improving, I potentially could see Burton, just the fact that he's goal kicking, if he does keep it, that's obviously a big asterisk. Yeah, I think Burton is potentially a good option to consider in your mid-range, because I feel like he's just got extra avenues to points that some of these other guys just don't have. So I personally am not starting with Burton. If I was to go down to this mid-range category, it would probably be him, just for the fact that he's got goal kicking. If he's not goal kicking, though, it doesn't become an option to me. And you do, again, have to put some faith into the Bulldogs. They don't have the best draw on start. Like, we're looking at some games like, maybe the Gold Coast Titans in round 3, maybe the Sharks, maybe Parramatta, but then you've got Melbourne and then the Knights before the bye in round 8. So the draw itself isn't amazing. Again, these are just other factors that make me think, well, if I can't take a punt because the draw is good, then just go with the safe, reliable guy in DBrown. Luke Brooks at 560k. I said I was going to talk about him a bit more in the 5-8 video when I mentioned him in the halfback video, but ultimately I'm probably not that convinced, mainly because I think with Manly, most of the attacking play is going to go through Turbo, Cherry Evans. I just don't see how Brooks is going to really be too heavily involved. He was more of a focal point for the Tigers, and so I kind of feel like I just need to see it before I can actually take the punt with him. And it's not like Manly's draw is amazing. They've got some decent games with Dragons in round 4, a lot of home games, which is good. And I guess the best thing with them is that they don't have a bye in the first 10 weeks. But with Brooks, look, he's 560k. If he comes out and kills it, then sure, we can maybe downgrade to him. But I don't want to take that punt from round 1. Now, Ezra Mam is probably the most interesting one to talk about here in this mid-range category. 21% owned, so he's got a very, very high ownership. 532k, average of 52. He averaged 55, I believe, as well in 2022. And the thing with him from last season was that he was the more consistent out of all of these options, 30% coefficient of variance. The biggest downside I have with Ezra Mam is that he averaged 52 and he scored 14 tries during the regular season. And of course, he had that amazing hat-trick in the grand final from last year. I do feel like that grand final is weighing on people's mind and is a bit of recency bias, because the thing is, from a Supercoach point of view, even if he scores multiple tries, we still didn't really see really big scores out of him last season. So for example, I'm looking at a game from round 2 last season against the Cowboys where he scored a double and he only scored 82 points. Now, 82 points is great. If you're paying 532k and you're getting 82 points from Ezra Mam, you'll take that. But it relied on him scoring a double. And in other games where he scored even a try, 48 points. There's other games where he scored 63 points with a try. Looking at some others here, 48 points when he scored a try as well. Like, his base stats are not fantastic, only 24. And I guess the thing with him is that, you know, he is second fiddle to Adam Reynolds. Now, the argument could be, well, he's ever improving. You know, we can see maybe a bump up in his average. And I think that's completely valid. But I just feel like he is very attacking stat reliant. So far, he hasn't shown the game where he can hit that really high floor, like a DBrown, for example. It kind of feels like he's going to give you maybe 30 points. And if you don't get really 30 to 35, and if you don't get that try to get him to that 48-50, you're kind of going to be sitting with that. The Broncos do have a fairly tough start. Now, granted, the Broncos, they were the grand finalists from last year. They are a good team. Just from a Supercoach point of view, that reliance on attacking stats, I am, to be honest, quite shocked at that 21% ownership. I get it. The price tag is good. He's got that appeal about him as a young gun, young talent. And look, this could blow up in my face. He could just go out and start scoring a try like every 2 games and he just keeps it up and he actually gets closer to a 60 average. So here's another one. I know it's a bit of a boring caveat, but he is one who I think I wouldn't be trusting, at least for the start, when he has shown that he has to be very reliant on getting those big tries to actually maintain like just a 52 average. I feel like someone like a Matt Burton, even playing in a struggling Bulldogs team, the fact that he had the goal kicking, he still managed to average 58. And I think because it's more of a thing where, you know, Ezra Mam scoring 14 tries, I feel like he's good enough to do that again this year. But if he did it again this year, maybe his average goes up to 55, 56. With Burton, as long as the Bulldogs generally improve and if he holds on to the goal kicking, that average could go to like the low 60s. And so I kind of feel like with Burton, maybe that's a safer bet for your mid-range option. So I definitely like Ezra Mam, amazing young talent. Just from a Supercoach point of view though, probably not for me. The final one I wanted to discuss in the mid-range was Metcalf from the Warriors. This one is really up in the air. I think it really comes down to the team list for the Warriors come round 1, because they've got a few options who could partner Sean Johnson in the halves. You've got Metcalf, you've got Chanel Harris-Tavita potentially, and you also do have Tamari Martin. I've got Tamari Martin on the next slide as well, but I'll quickly probably just cover him off here. Look, potentially the guy who's named in round 1 could maybe be an option, but for 83k, he doesn't feel like a guy who I'd be confident to rely on as my starting 5'8". If that's what you're looking for, I'd probably want to lean towards someone in the 500Ks, maybe someone like a Matt Burton. But Metcalf to me just feels a little bit risky, and it's not like the Warriors have a great draw on paper either. And I do feel like Metcalf is probably a little bit more attacking stat reliant. If you look at the stats below me, Burton obviously has the highest for scoring average because of his goal kicking. Ezra Mam was next because he scored 14 tries. And third is actually Metcalf, because Metcalf did score quite a few tries as well last season. So again, the guys who are scoring a lot of tries, and it's a bit more of a question mark about the repeatability of that, they're generally the ones who I probably don't want to be having my faith in, I guess, for round 1. I'll quickly mention Jaden Campbell as well. He was a very popular option, but I'll flash a screenshot on the screen now as well from NRL Physio. He's not probably going to be expected back until round 4 or round 5, so that effectively kills him as an option for round 1. I know he was very popular, but before I finished putting these slides together for the 5/8, that news came out, so I decided not to really put those numbers in because I feel like no one's going to consider him from round 1 if he's not available. So yeah, just a small note on Jaden Campbell. So finally, taking a look at some of the cheapie options available in the 5/8 spot. I actually do think this is a spot where luckily we've got some cheapie options that we can actually rely on for round 1. So I quickly I mentioned Tamara Martin before as well. He could be maybe a good backup if he does start in round 1 at 363k. But just quickly on Tamara Martin from last season, he did have one score where he scored 91 points, but outside of that, his scores were 30, 29, 40, and 36 in his 80-minute games. I do feel like he's just going to be maybe, plodder is probably not the right word for a 5/8, but when Sean Johnson is running the show for the Warriors, I feel like he's going to be that second fiddle. And again, we talked about that Warriors draw before. It's not the best on paper, so he could be a backup, but I do think there are some cheaper options who would be probably just a better use of saving that money instead of going with Tamara Martin. Aiden Caesar, we spoke about him a bit more in the halfback video. I haven't really changed my views on him. I think the fact that they've got that round 1 bye isn't great. He probably, I suspect, will be the goal kicker for the Titans, which is a positive for him. He's fairly highly owned at 13%. And below me, I've got his historic averages as well. Just doesn't strike me as a guy who I think will be a big SuperCoach scorer, and you are banking again on the West Tigers. So 345k. He probably does make more sense to put in your 5/8 spot than I think the halfback spot. Given the halfback, you've got the likes of Nico and Cleary, who've got that really, really big ceiling. And if you are struggling for money in your 5/8 spot, then maybe you could go cheap with something like an Aiden Caesar KO Weeks combination. But there is some risk to that as well. You are banking on a cheapie who maybe doesn't have the best job security, and also then Aiden Caesar, who hopefully is goal kicking, and you're relying then on the West Tigers. And the 5/8 spot, there are definitely still points on offer there that you can chase. So I'm probably not going to be siding with Aiden Caesar, but if he comes out and kills it, then we can always potentially downgrade to him. Now, Carl Flanagan is actually a pretty interesting one, 310k. He's probably not my preferred cheapie, because there are some question marks still with him about, will he be goal kicking? I've got a screenshot below me of his average scores per game in previous seasons. When he was doing well with the Roosters, he had 2019 and 2020 averages of 50 and 59. So I believe he was goal kicking in both of those seasons as well. Now, the Dragons' current goal kicker is Zach Lomax, but Carl Flanagan is a pretty accurate goal kicker. So I do think he's someone who, if he does get the goal kicking, he could be a little bit more tempting than someone like a KO Weeks. Now, obviously, who knows how many points that the Dragons will score, so how much does the goal kicking come into your thinking? But he's only going to be another 37k on KO Weeks, and if he does get the goal kicking tee, that does add some extra appeal to him, where he has proven in the past when if he's playing in a good team and he's the goal kicker, he can get to that 50 average. So he's not one I'm probably currently got in my round 1 team, mainly because I've got KO Weeks, who's coming in a little bit cheaper. But definitely keep a note of Flanagan. Let's watch and see in the trials if he does goal kick. I think that would be pretty important to see. I guess the other thing with the Dragons as well is that with Shane Flanagan coming in, he's probably going to have more of a focus on defense, maybe not so much on the attack. So maybe they're going to try to win games, 12-10, 10-6, not necessarily try to go all guns blazing and score a lot of points. But yeah, Flanagan is definitely an interesting one that I've got marked down as potentially maybe a better cheapie than KO Weeks if he gets that goal kicking. So KO Weeks, 36% owned. He's the second highest 5/8, and I do think he is probably the best cheapie to go for, just based on that based on the week 1 of the trials team list for the Raiders. So they've got Chevy Stewart playing at fullback, they've got KO Weeks at number 6, and they've got Ethan Strange at number 7. So that puts more of a question mark around Ethan Strange to me than it does KO Weeks, because I fully believe that Jamal Fogarty will come back into that halfback spot. So if Strange is playing in that number 7 spot, I mean, it could be a bit of a shootout between Weeks and Strange as to who's the one they maybe opt for at fullback. I think the fact that Weeks has been named at number 6, we haven't seen him play yet, but he was brought to the club. It feels like he's going to get the first crack at 5'8" and replace Jack White in that Raiders team. So I feel like for the time being, he's probably got the best job security out of him and Ethan Strange. And at 273k, look, he's at a good cheap price. not a big sample size from him last season from Manly, and he never really played at the number 6 spot from Manly last season. In his 70-minute games from last season, he had an average of 30.5. So look, you're looking at 4 points of value there, but you'd hope that with a Raiders team around him, and if he gets first crack at it, he could be someone who maybe gets closer to that 35-40 average, and at least is a good moneymaker for us at the start of the season. So I do think he's probably the preferred cheapie option to start with, I think, for round 1. And I've kind of made my comments about Ethan Strange as well. Really comes down to what the team lists show for round 1, but I feel like because he was named at number 7 in that preseason trial team list, feels like he's maybe just occupying that spot until Fogarty really does actually play in maybe either the last trials or in round 1. The last two that I've got here, both from the West Tigers, Fainu and Lachlan Galvin, both bottom dollar cheapies, 204k. The only notes I've really got about them is that they may potentially partner Aiden Caesar in the 5'8 spot. I actually realised there's another 5'8 who I didn't include in this list here, which is Jaden Sullivan, who's about 391k. I do believe Sullivan is going to get first crack at that 5'8 spot to partner Aiden Caesar. The reason I haven't really advocated for Sullivan, I guess, is that, again, it's that round 1 buy. Aiden Caesar is also cheaper than Jaden Sullivan, and if he's the goal kicker, he automatically becomes, to me, a better option than Sullivan. So not really considering Sullivan in the 5'8 position, just to quickly touch on him. The only comments I've got about Fainu and Galvin is a quote that came out from Benji Marshall during the preseason, which was that Caesar will be handing a starting role, but Marshall said it was up to youngsters Sullivan, Fainu and Galvin to make their case to partner him. Now, I read that Galvin, I think, has picked up an injury and he won't actually play for the Tigers this week in their first preseason trial, which is a bit of a shame. So we may potentially get a cheapie there, but again, boring answer. Comes down to round 1 team lists. Although even then, the West Tigers have got the bye in round 1. So there's probably some benefit in that because they don't play in round 1, the price changes for the West Tigers players won't happen until round 4. So it gives you some time to see what happens with the West Tigers. You probably think that they're not going to come out and absolutely go guns blazing, that you're going to miss out on a bunch of points for them as well. So again, a couple of options just to note down in your black book as to maybe potential cheapies down the line. But I think in summary, KO Weeks to me still feels like the best cheapie option to consider with your 5'8. And I guess to summarize all of that together, the Dylan Brown KO Weeks combination is currently what I've got in my round 1 setup. I do believe it's probably going to be the one that I go with, barring any other surprises if I need to make money somewhere in my team and maybe drop Dylan Brown. But as we've kind of touched on, really outside of Dylan Brown and Munster, it's maybe taking a punt on someone like a Matt Burton or maybe an Ezra Mann. Really, I don't see many other options. So this is why I'm looking at a position where I think I'm just going to spend the big bucks, get the guy who I'm the most confident in, and I think just be a bit more content that I've got someone who I'm happy with and not have to take a punt on someone who I've got some doubts over. So that's my general summary of the 5'8 spot. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed that video, and if you did, please do give it a like, and please subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content during the preseason. Hope you all enjoyed it, and see you all in the next one. Cheers.